Did you ever wonder how horror cinema started? If the answer is no, feel free to skip this episode. But if you are interested, stay with me. Early horror cinema had some growing pains, but it laid out the foundation of scares yet to come. Let's set the stage. The electric light had recently made its debut. Industrialization meant that people's lives were becoming more comfortable. Telephones, radio, and heavily developed railways made communication and travel easier. More and more people were living in large urban centers instead of in the countryside. Life was changing. But change scared people, and they had good reason to be afraid. Conflict seemed to manifest throughout Europe and in the colonies. And these conflicts soon became wars in the age of the newly developed machine gun. There was the Cuban War of Independence in 1895, the Spanish-American War in 1898, as well as the Boxer Rebellion and the Second Boer War, both starting in 1899 and lasting into the first couple of years of the 20th century. Dozens of further conflicts appeared over the next 2 decades, finally culminating in the Great War, the First World War, lasting from 1914 to 1918. It was an age of killing, and death had become industrial. People knew what was happening. With a society more and more enlightened by news and books and theater, it was only natural that horror would blossom as a genre. Bram Stoker's vampire novel Dracula was published in 1897, and it captured the climate of fear and change in contemporary Great Britain. It had been preceded by classics such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Robert Louis Stevenson's The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the works of Edgar Allan Poe. A contemporary and equally important horror novel was H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau, published in 1896. That book straddled the line between horror and science fiction, and the two genres have often crossed paths in the years since. Soon after Dracula and Moreau, several other famous horror stories made their marks. The W. W. Jacobs short story The Monkey's Paw arrived in 1902 and made a huge impact, and M.R. James's Ghost Stories of the Antiquary chilled the reading public in 1904 and continues to chill them until this very day. The stage was not to be outdone, with the naturalistic horror style of Grand Guignol Theatre first appearing in 1897 and lasting until 1962 before finally fading. People wanted horror, and cinema was slowly developing into the art form of the masses. But it was, as of yet, unable to provide the true horror experience audiences craved. The first motion pictures were simple motifs, like workers leaving a factory. Enter illusionist Georges Méliès, whose trick films changed the cinematic landscape. Méliès also made the first known horror film, this film, The Haunted Castle. By today's standard, this 4-minute short is more magic act than cinema narrative. But every step counts, and this was the very first step into horror cinema. More films would soon follow. The problem with analyzing the early horror genre is that many of the films made during this period have disappeared. Of all silent films produced, it is estimated that only between 10 and 20% of them survive today. Such is the case with the first werewolf movie, simply titled The Werewolf. The last print of that one vanished in a fire in 1924, merely 10 years after it was produced. The same fate nearly befell Frankenstein from 1910. This film was perhaps the first significant step towards narrative horror. For years it was considered lost, until a private collector revealed he owned the print. Thankfully, the film can today be seen. While it may seem a bit wooden by modern standards, it is an incredibly important film, and well worth seeing for Frankenstein aficionados. Note that the film is still firmly rooted in the Georges Méliès magic trick style of cinema, but that it also tries to maintain a narrative plot. This Frankenstein adaptation isn't the story that Mary Shelley told in her groundbreaking novel back in 1818, but it is a story with a cohesive beginning, middle, and an end. What followed were a slew of borderline horror films that adapted novels, plays, and mythology. Only 6 years after Frankenstein, the second Mary Shelley adaptation was released. This one was called Life Without Soul, and it was feature-length. However, the film is today lost, and it is hard to judge its impact on cinema. Other early horror films include adaptations of Arthur Conan Doyle's mystery novel, The Hound of the Baskervilles, of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, of Hans Heinz Evers' Alraune, and of several Edgar Allan Poe stories, including The Mask of Red Death, adapted in Germany as The Plague of Florence, and of The Telltale Heart, adapted by D.W. Griffith as The Avenging Conscience. Few of these films are readily available, and some of them are missing, but they all had in common the fact that they were adaptations of famous literary works, and they often tried to convey at least some aspects of their source material. The benefit of this is that we still know their stories, even if the films are hard to find. That literary knowledge makes it a bit easier to guess what the films may have been like, and thus chart the development of horror cinema. Let's look at the first adaptations of The Island of Dr. Moreau and The Phantom of the Opera. In the case of The Island of Dr. Moreau, which was filmed in France in 1911, all that seems to survive are these images from a 1913 trade journal. Going a bit deeper down the internet rabbit hole, I discovered that the film, released in the US as The Island of Terror, might not even have been an adaptation of the H.G. Wells novel, but rather an adaptation of the 1908 book Le Docteur Lerne sous Dieu by Maurice Renard. Please forgive my terrible French pronunciation, but it's the best I can do. Renard's novel, however, was actually a ripoff of The Island of Dr. Moreau. So, I'm not even sure what conclusion to draw from that. Is the film an adaptation of H.G. Wells' story or Renard's story? I don't think anybody can answer that question until we see the film, and that might never happen. Things get even more murky with the first Phantom of the Opera, filmed in Germany in 1916. Very little is known about the film, as all references to it are through second-hand sources. I wanted very much to find some stills or posters to show you, but not even they survive. This picture of leading lady Aud Nissen is as close as I got. But at least, with both these films we know their basic premises, and that they could be included in the horror genre by virtue of legacy alone. Somewhat easier to quantify is the 1915 version of The Golem, where a clay statue comes to life and does the bidding of its master. This film is mostly lost, but we have some fragments. And Paul Wegener, here playing the Golem, appeared as the character again in the 1920 Expressionist remake. The two films likely told a similar story, though it seems the 1915 version was set in present day, meaning around 1915. While the 1920 version had a historical setting, set in Prague around the 16th century. While largely incomplete, we can make out a good portion of the puzzle that is early horror cinema. What we can learn from the surviving films, and the tales they were based on, is that the horror genre wasn't fully formed yet. Horror films of the era relied on adventure and fantasy to communicate with audiences. The atmosphere was more fairy tale than fright. Perhaps that wasn't so surprising given the politically unstable end of the 19th century and the devastation of the First World War. Bypassing censors and local laws made going full horror somewhat difficult. In the case of the third adaptation of Mary Shelley's novel, The Monster of Frankenstein, made in Italy in 1920, local censors cut so much out of the film that the point was basically lost. Nothing but a few posters and still images remain from this movie. Horror cinema finally found its footing in late 1919, when a group of talented filmmakers and artists in Germany began production on The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Despite hard times in Germany after losing World War I, the local art community was thriving. From the turn of the century and throughout the war, German artists developed the artistic style now known as Expressionism. The art style criticized a decadent and overly industrial non-humanist society, and it rejected realism in favor of poetic interpretation. The artists were far more concerned with the inner state of their subjects and the inner state of society than they were in romanticism or realism. By expressing the internal mental state with light, shadows, color, and abstract application, the artists were able to psychoanalyze the state of the world, while at the same time connecting with the emotional state of the public. The art style was later deemed dangerous by the Nazis, and they were right. Expressionism was dangerous, because it perfectly applied intellectual thought with emotional state, and it was able to truly get under the skin of Germany and its people. Another effect of Expressionism was how perfectly it lined up with the horror genre's approach to the human condition. It was a perfect marriage of style and substance. The cabinet of Dr. Caligari used the expressionist art style completely, even adapting it to actors' performances. The sets, and even the shadows, were painted. Instead of using extensive lighting, the filmmakers let the art style speak for the light. The shadows you see are painted on the set. It was a whole new way to approach horror cinema, and actually a whole new way to approach cinema in general. Caligari would be released early in 1920, and it marks a shift in horror cinema history. The film practically invented expressionist filmmaking, which dominated the horror, fantasy, and science fiction genres of German filmmaking throughout the 1920s. Later filmmakers were heavily inspired by this style, and we see the expressionistic aesthetic appear in the works of Alfred Hitchcock and Tim Burton, and many, many others. Caligari's influence was enormous, and it pioneered many cinematic techniques. The set design of Caligari became a way to communicate the inner state of characters and society at large. Atmosphere became a cinematic tool in a far greater way, and the film even established several horror tropes. No, not the fact that the ending was a dream. That had been done many times before, including in The Avenging Conscience, where director D.W. Griffith avoided the original ending of Edgar Allan Poe's story by having it all be a nightmare. The trope I am referring to is the twist ending. Dr. Caligari is at the end of the film revealed not to be the villain, but rather the director of a mental hospital. And the hero, well, he is shown to be insane. We've had twist endings in horror cinema ever since. Interestingly, this wasn't the original ending the filmmakers wanted. The plan was to have Caligari be the bad guy all along, but due to censorship pressure, that plan was nixed. The authority-friendly ending, where the government knows best, was inserted. Yeah, that worked out real well for Germany. No matter which ending you'd have preferred to see, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is a stunning film. I wouldn't go so far to say that it invented modern horror cinema, but I would certainly claim that it reinvented it. Its stylistic approach allowed the filmmakers the freedom to explore deeper, darker fears. Its view of human beings gave room for more gruesome characters in future films. Its twist ending conditioned audiences not to expect the hero to win, at least not in horror films. And it taught audiences that fear could, and should, be expressed on screen, and that it was okay to lose yourself in it. With the stroke of genius that was Caligari, horror cinema matured into a truly narrative art form, finally rivaling the horrors of literature, finally becoming the genre we know and love today. My name is Wolfcraft. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of History of Horror. If you have, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. Join me next time for History of Horror, Episode 4, Marion Crane Took a Shower. If you're interested in checking out some of my other work, I'm also an author. My sci-fi novel, God of Desolation, is available on Amazon. Thanks a plenty.